Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. What do you do if you have a loaf of stale bread and a block of old cheese? Well, we're gonna find out today. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So the recipe for today is out of Anne Cook's 1760 cookbook, Professed Cookery. Super simple recipe. It's called To Make a Cheshire Cheese Soup. Put a crumb of a penny loaf into 3 pints of water, boil it, grate half a pound of old Cheshire and put it into the bread and boil it. Super simple recipe, right? It's only got water, it's got bread, it's got cheese, but it's one of these recipes that could be, not necessarily, her reference here, but it could be one of those recipes that it's like, okay, how do I get rid of these things? It's a very efficient recipe. The crumb of a penny loaf, that can be stale bread. Bread that's gone bad, you pare it off the bad parts, keep the good parts, and you're using just crumb, right? And then the cheese. She calls for an old Cheshire cheese. An old Cheshire cheese was one of those long-lived cheese in the time period. It's one of those kind of hard cheeses they would leave around, and they would actually age it. And cheese here it's a food preservation technique. What happens when you have a lot of milk? You make cheese. So cheese is a great item when you want something milk-based and maybe cows aren't giving milk at that time, or you've had milk that was prolific at one part of the time of the year and you need food later on. And so this cheese is a perfect preservation method. Both of these things go together, make a very efficient food source. So we're going to start up with 3 pints of boiling water. That isn't a ton of water. It'll come up to boil pretty quickly, and you can put your breadcrumbs in, or that crumb of a penny loaf. These pieces are pretty big. You might want to chop those up very, very fine. It'll break down a little bit faster. You can use panko or other breadcrumbs. I like using actual bread though, because it just seems better to me. The crumb of a penny loaf in the recipe, we're not sure that the penny loaf kind of changes in size, but it's not a big loaf of bread. 6, maybe 8 ounces, something like that would be a good place to start with the amount of breadcrumb. After your bread is boiled a little while, it's broken down a bit and kind of smoothed out. Now it's time to bring in that cheese. You want 8 ounces of cheese. The recipe calls for Old Cheshire. Now, that's almost impossible to come up with here in North America. So you can use some other cheeses. You could use Parmesan cheese. You could use, basically any cheese you got around the house. You don't want to use a stringy cheese like mozzarella. So here I'm using a cheddar. That's going to turn out great. Again, I chopped up this cheese into bits. You can grate it. In fact, she calls for grating the cheese so that it mixes in and breaks down and gets smooth very quickly as it goes into this boiling water. Once it's back up to boiling, it's basically done. You don't really need to keep going unless you want it to smooth out. Don't let this boil too long. If you do, make sure to keep stirring it. You don't want it to stick to the bottom and kind of, build up a thick layer. Now it's basically ready to come off the fire and pour into those bowls. Let it cool down a little bit. We added a little bit of spring greens. We've got some wild garlic growing right outside, so I thought this would be perfect just to sprinkle up on top of as a garnish. And traditionally in soup dishes in this time period, little toasted sippets. Sometimes you'll put a piece of toast in the bottom and pour your soup on top, or you'll stick little sippets in like this. So we've got some sippets. Let's find out just how this tasted. Now it's smoothed right out. Let's find out. Wonderful texture, wonderful. Got a great cheesy flavor. This particular cheese has just enough salt in with it, so it tastes great that way. I might add a little pepper just for the fun of it, because I enjoy pepper. Let's find out what it's like with one of these little sips. So very good. And the smell is great. It'll fill your kitchen with a wonderful smell. A great way to use stale bread, or not stale bread for that matter, and cheese. A very filling meal, and just tremendously easy to do. Very simple, just ingredients you've got right around the house. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're digging into the 18th century origins of scrambled eggs. This one ought to be fun. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. It's another cold January day here in Indiana, and we're here by the roaring fire, and I've been thinking about how I generally research for doing an 18th century recipe. And really, there's several different things I look for, and one of the main things, though, is does our modern food that we eat today, where does it connect with history? Where does it go 200 years ago, 300 years ago? And one of the main ways we look at that, even if the recipe is almost the same, one of the things that's really, really different is the environment that you have to cook in. And today's episode is, well, it's very connected with that topic because we're doing something that I mean, you might cook every day for breakfast, or you can go to any diner and get it, scrambled eggs. But how do you make them when you've got this roaring fire and a bunch of coals? The recipe might be very, very similar, but how we cook it definitely has to have some changes to it. So if you go digging in the 18th century cookbooks and you look for scrambled eggs, you turn to the back of the index and look it up, you're never going to find it. It's not there because it's not called scrambled eggs. In the 18th century, buttered eggs is what you want to dig for. Now, I had a choice of a half a dozen, 8 or 10 different buttered egg recipes to choose from, but I'm going to read this one. Maybe you'll see why I chose this particular one. This is out of the New and Easy Method of Cookery by Elizabeth Cleland. This is 1775. This particular cookbook leans toward the Northern English cooking or Scottish cooking. This one was actually printed in Edinburgh. Let's see. To butter eggs, take 8 eggs, put them in a stew pan after they are well beaten with a little salt and nutmeg, right? And put them to 1/4 pound of sweet butter, a spoonful of sweet cream, keep them stirring all the time they are on the fire from the bottom of the pan. Then put them on toasted bread when they are thick. Perfect scrambled eggs recipe. Of course, it's got the wonderful addition of an 18th century cookbook, and they put nutmeg in it. And I guess the thing that really pops out to me is I'm not sure about the order of how these things go in. And of course, it's got a massive quantity of butter. So this has got to be good. So let's get started on this. I've got some bread already toasting. So let's cover these ingredients. There aren't very many. We need some eggs. I'm going to make a half recipe of this because I don't need that many scrambled eggs. So 4 nice eggs. We need a little bit of salt. Obviously some nutmeg. I'm going to go ahead and add pepper. Most of the other recipes did include pepper, at least at the end. And then we just need the butter and the cream. And then at the very end, we'll need the toasts. So not very many ingredients. Let's get started. So now comes the challenging part of cooking this. Obviously, if you're in a modern kitchen, you've got these dials and controls that you can just get the right amount of heat. And if you've ever done scrambled eggs, you can't cook them fast. That's a bad thing. And in this circumstance, we have to figure out how to cook these slow. In a lot of 18th century recipes, they actually talk about this part because it is challenging. We're gonna some of the recipes talk about cooking these eggs over a chafing dish. So a little jar of like coals, right? So we're gonna bring some coals out of the main fire so it's not as hot. We have a little bit more control. We're gonna use our spider pan that's got some nice distance off the fire. And really our choice for heat control is distance away from the fire. So it even talks about having this not too close to the fire, moving it away from the fire. So we're gonna have some coals down underneath. If this gets too hot, I can knock the coals down or I can push them out of the way. So here's our egg mixture. It's already ready to go in, but it can be confusing about how this recipe works. You have to use other recipes to help interpret what this one is like. It says to put the eggs into the pan, and then it says to beat them well, but it means beat them well and then put them in the pan. So obviously we don't want to beat them right in the pan necessarily. And the butter, some recipes seem to imply that you melt the butter and put it in the mixture, and other ones say no, the butter goes in cold, then it just goes in along with the eggs and it melts at the same time. So that's what we're going to use, even though this particular recipe doesn't mention that. That's how we're going to do it. And the cream just kind of goes in at the same time. I would normally just whisk it straight in. That's not how the recipe does. So let's do it just like the recipe. These smell wonderful. They're on this wonderful toast. We're right here by the fire. And one of the great things I love about this particular recipe is here we are in this primitive cabin, and in so many of the resources that you read about people living in a cabin like this, you find out that they have very few utensils. And the bread is the perfect utensil in this case. It's actually made to pick right up, eat off of it. You don't need a fork, you don't need a spoon, you don't need anything to eat these eggs. Let's try them out. The texture is perfect on these eggs. And one of the really, really interesting things when I was thinking about this, usually when I make scrambled eggs, I put cheese in there because it, kind of thickens it up and does. This tastes just like they've got cheese in them, but they don't. Just amazing flavor, and of course it had so much wonderful butter in there to bring that flavor in, and it didn't stick in the pan at all. Even a pan like that I was using that is not a non-stick pan, let me tell you. Eggs came right out of that pan so easy, and it tastes so good. So in this one, it's all about that slow cooking. You get this incredible texture. You don't want that brown stuff that happens at the bottom of the pan, and the recipe said, be careful of that. Now there is one recipe that's a little bit later on that actually talks about coming over the top of these when they're finished and warming them up with a salamander. Actually, it says brown them. I don't think he actually means that. I think he means to make sure they're nice and warm. Such a wonderful recipe, and we see scrambled eggs 250 years ago, almost exactly like we make today, except of course, that wonderful addition of nutmeg. I love the comparison between the two. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're talking about the sailor's favorite drink, grog. Thanks for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. The major component, the important part of grog is rum, and rum was so very important to North America in the 18th century. It's a very vital, important item that's being traded with the West Indies all up and down the east coast of North America at the time. And it's not just important as a trade item, but it's important as part of the rations and provisions of sailors, of regular soldiers, and regular workers alike. So it's something that everyone in North America is experiencing, using, and making money off of, trading it back and forth. It's so very important to the war effort that in early 1776, Admiral Graves is sending out ships to go down to the West Indies to pick up rum because they're out of rum. It's vitally important to the fleet at that time. So he sends out a special ship to go. He actually has them tear out parts of the ship and get more kegs so they can fill the ship up with rum and bring it back because they are desperately in need of rum for their sailors, for their Navy. It's the only way that people are going to work. Shipbuilding was going on during the Revolutionary War, and the shipbuilders were paid not only in just regular money, but in rum during the day. Each and every builder got his share of rum, just like he was a sailor or a soldier. So we find that they need to have this rum for everyone to be happy with their work. And there are multiple references to that idea of, it's their one solace in life. It's the only reason they have to keep going. Colonel Ethan Allen in captivity, at one point, he said the conditions were terrible, but they still had their provisions, their salt provisions, their salt beef, their salt pork, and they had their rum. And he thought that the rum was one of the only reasons why so many people survived in that particular situation. So they not only thought about it as something that was a solace in life, but as something that was medicinal. Rum was part of what was keeping them healthy. At least that's what he thought. The other main component of grog is water. And water in the 18th century was a tricky thing, wasn't it? You never were quite sure about whether your water was, safe, whether it was good. It was on board ship. You had to go and collect all this water. You put it in kegs. You stored it in the hold of your ship. And it wasn't very long at all, 2 or 3 weeks, a month later, and the water that you put in your kegs is going bad. It's getting green. It's doing all kinds of, microbes are growing in it. So the water goes bad very rapidly on board ship. And even if you're not on board ship, surface water can be a questionable item. So we find out that grog, making your water and your rum into grog, is very helpful because it sort of sterilizes your water. And in every reference to a ship's log, you'll find the ships, as soon as they come into any kind of a port, probably the very first thing they're thinking about if they have to leave soon is getting fresh wood and getting fresh water. You have to have water for your men, and your water is constantly going bad. So where does grog come from? Well, in the 17th century, the British Navy started to use rum in lieu of beer. If you were in home waters, the sailors would have a beer ration each and every day, but they also had these substitutes. If you weren't in home waters, you would have other items available, and rum started to become an obvious and consistent substitute. But the problem was that the sailors would hold back their rum ration for 2 or 3 days straight, maybe longer, and then they would drink it all at once and they would become intoxicated, and that was very dangerous on board ship. You had work to do, very dangerous work, hard work to do, and a fuddled mind was not helpful at all. So Admiral Vernon in the 1740s, he decided he would come up with a way that would make that harder for them to do and maybe make that rum a little less intoxicating. And he made sure to have their rum mixed with water in a 4-to-1 ratio. Made it harder to store back for any period of time, and hopefully he thought it would make them less intoxicated if they drank it in its diluted form. Now this term, it turns into this term of grog, and it turns into not just a naval drink, but a drink that other people would drink also. You'll find multiple references to this idea of grog from about 1750 on. And Admiral Vernon's nickname was Old Grog because of items he would wear, grogrem cloth. And so that's where this grog term comes from, at least most people think. And grog keeps living on. It stays a part of the ration of sailors in the British Navy up until the 1970s, and it's part of the rations in the American Navy until about the Civil War or so. So not only is it right there happening in the Revolutionary War, but it stays on for 100 years later. So to mix these properly together, you really need a Jill cup. So the standard ration for almost every reference that you see is half a pint per man per day, and this was usually divided into 2 pieces. So we need a quarter of a pint or a half a cup. That's where the Jill cup comes into. That is half a cup. That's a half a cup measurement. And we created this this mixture here, probably a little stiffer than the standard ration here. And I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit of lime to mine. And now we have our cup of grog, our standard. And you can imagine you'd have this twice a day, this full cup full. And it's actually quite a tasty little drink. It's so simple. It's just water and rum, and then just that hair of citrus in there. It's medicinal, obviously, with all that wonderful citrus in there. And it's a very, very palatable way to drink this. And you'll find just any number of references in the 18th century to not only sailors, but regular landsmen alike drinking a grog drink. Now, many times you'll see people using a drink like this as a way of convincing people, oh, come in and have a cup of grog with me. And then, of course, you'll find those in the court records. Something bad happened usually right after that. But grog was, so pervasive in the 18th century. Every man of war, every merchant ship, this was something that was commonly happening with all the hands on board. It is, the way that men are, it's one of the ways that they were kept happy at a job that was impossibly difficult and deadly at times, quite often. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we have special guest in the kitchen, Michael Dragoo. We will be cooking steaks fried
with an oyster sauce.
Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So, Michael, you brought us this very, very interesting recipe. Yeah. This one's from...
It's Elizabeth Cleland, 1755. The book is one that you offer. It's a new and easy method of cookery.
Right. So, an interesting cookbook. It's kind of got a little bit of a Scottish background to it.
It does. French and Indian War, based out of England.
Yeah. So this steaks fried, we don't normally it's a little strange.
No, and I without reading the whole thing through, it says I'm going to take the flat, I'm going to cut them flat with my chopping knife. We don't find cuts of meat generally like you'd find in a big box store these days.
Right. And it's like today we would fry these up. Yep. These might be a little bit more expensive. In the time period, she calls for a tender cut, so not something hard.
Right.
And I guess that's typical. We might get that at any steak restaurant when we go. But this oyster sauce,
it's not just the fact of using the oysters, but it's what else we've added to this sauce that makes it so unusual. And when you're done with it, it's pretty tasty.
You think so? I haven't tried it yet.
I can't lie in front of the camera. No, I don't think so.
No, it's going to be great. I'm sure it is. So read us the recipe.
Sure. Cut your steaks off any tender part of the beef. Flat them with your chopping knife and put them on a hot brander on a clear, quick fire. On a quick fire is about 350, 400 degrees. Turning them often that the gravy does not run out. Have your sauce ready. Make it thus. Scald your oysters and wash them clean in their own liquor. Then strain the liquor into a saucepan. Put to it a piece of butter worked in flour, 2 or 3 shallots, pounded pepper, cloves, and nutmeg. Salt it to your taste and put to it a glass of white wine and the rind and juice of a lemon. So pour it on your ashet of steaks boiling hot. Garnish them with pickles. So there's lots of things we can address here. What some of these phrases mean and all, but...
and then there's the question also of which one we're going to cook up first, because of course we don't want our steaks getting cold, so we'll probably work on this sauce, right?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Okay, so how are we going to get started on this sauce?
Well, the first step is to heat up a pan, and we've done that, and we're going to introduce some flour and some butter together.
Okay, so normally you would do this over a stovetop with your little with a little pan. But this one's so thick and heavy that it will hold the heat.
Right,
So we can basically cook with it. We've got a ball of butter.
And in all of these recipes, they are asking us, it might be the size of a walnut, they'll give us a size sometimes, but you're just pushing as much flour into the butter as you can. That's acting as a roux. Today we'd use equal parts of butter and flour to make our roux, and this is how they did it. And frequently it's not the first step. In this recipe it is.
That one
so
goes
that's melting. We're going to add some shallots. Once again, this is reduced down. Next step is to introduce the oyster's liquor. We've filtered it through a piece of linen. We're just going to put that in right now. That's the base of our sauce. That's good right there.
Yeah, I don't think I would make an oyster sauce with its juice and everything.
No, I
for a
sure
steak
wouldn't
today.
either. But I'll tell you, when it's done, it tastes differently.
Okay, good. So I've got spices here. What else goes in this?
Oh, don't put them all in, just a finger of each.
Okay.
In this case, we're going to add some salt.
So a little bit of salt.
Some coarse pepper.
Coarse pepper.
And if you would take the honors.
Oh, yeah.
We've got some cloves right here. I'll do that.
Well,
here.
we got nutmeg. So nutmeg has to go in.
Nutmeg. Yeah, your handlers told me that I can't bring recipes unless they have nutmeg in them.
That's right.
You are the
Only nutmeg.
necromancer of nutmeg. That's
There
right.
we go.
And that's it. And we're gonna put some lemon in. If you squeeze a lemon, I'll get a little of the peel, the rind in. There we go.
So this sauce, as it is, has this wonderful, complex smell. I'll bet it's going to taste very, very wonderful and interesting. What's next with this?
We're just going to get it back on the fire and let it simmer for a little bit.
Right.
Just to kind of reduce down a bit.
So we're going to steam these oysters, right?
She says scald your oysters,
Right.
and I interpret that as steaming.
Yeah, obviously we don't want to, but they don't get cooked a lot. That's what she means by the scalding. It's almost like blanching them. But we're going to steam them, which is great. Our steaming setup is, we got a pot here with just a little bit of water in it.
Yeah, I don't have a steamer from the time periods, but I do have this
You've
little
got a
guy.
colander,
So we're going to put the oysters in this, and we're going to put a lid on it and put it over the fire.
So we're flipping these over faster than I would do in a standard, cooking a steak today.
Right, she's trying to sear them. In this time period, they seem to always be piercing the meat, the flesh of the meat, and collecting the drippings. They call the gravy. The gravy in this time period is the juices, the blood from the animal.
This recipe specifically says keep that gravy in. So keep turning them over.
Keep turning them over.
Don't let them drip.
Try to sear them, yes. Here we are.
So here's our finished dish. It looks interesting.
Yes.
We got this nice pickle garnish.
Right.
She says to garnish with pickle. I'm not sure if she really means pickles like this or a pickle kind of relish, but that's okay. And we got some wonderful smells and flavors. Boy, that sauce smelled good. Question is does it add a lot to the flavor?
We will report back momentarily.
So let's try this out. We got a nice medium rare.
I'll give it a fair shot here.
Yeah.
Here we go. Once again, unexpected. I don't normally eat oysters, and it's interesting.
It's actually, at least as it was made here, it's a very mild sauce.
It is. It's not overwhelming.
It's not overwhelming. If I was going to redo it, I might push the salt and pepper a little bit more. I'm not even getting the nutmeg in there, so I'll toss some more in there.
She doesn't mention seasoning the meat at all, and so we didn't.
Right.
We're taking the recipe literally. Sometimes it's left to interpretation.
Right.
And they might have, so.
Even whether the oysters come back in, you don't actually see that in the recipe.
She says to steam the oysters. I think it's assumed you put them back in the sauce, and which we did.
Right.
But why would you steam the oyster and not? So I know we're not collecting the drippings from it.
Right,
So.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
but, you know, going back on there, we could add that in here.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's a great little sauce. Of course, today, you know, we would just say, hey, that steak is so good, why would we want to ruin it with any sauce at all, right? I think she wanted to, you know, perk these up a little bit, make it just a little bit fancier by having these things on it. When today, boy, we would just eat this steak and enjoy it.
Yep. I would encourage you to try it. It's different. It's completely different than what you're used to.
Welcome to this special episode of 18th Century Cooking. We're going to be doing something celebratory today. We're in the cabin. It's the end of the year. It's like New Year's Eve, and we thought we would do something kind of extra special. We'll be doing a heated drink. This one's called a flip, very popular in the 18th century, and we'll be doing a recipe from the very early 19th century. This one should taste great. So this particular drink is called a flip, and we see references to this term flip in the late 17th century, all through the 18th century. But this recipe is from 1822 because while we get references to it early on, we don't necessarily get a great description. This is a good description of it. To make a quart of flip, put the ale on the fire to warm. Beat up 3 or 4 eggs with 4 ounces of moist sugar, a teaspoonful of grated nutmeg or ginger, and a quartern of good old rum or brandy. When the ale is near to boil, put it into one pitcher, and the rum and the eggs, etc., into another, and turn it from one pitcher into another till it is smooth as cream. Then you serve it up. Well, we're ready to get started here. I've got probably about a quart of ale. I've got in this little vessel here, and we're going to put it to warm by the fire. We don't want it to boil up too fast. I'm going to go and work on getting the other ingredients ready. Okay, the ale is on the fire. What other ingredients do we need? I've got some eggs here. Probably going to use 3 or 4 eggs. We have sugar. That's one of the other main ingredients here. And this is a simple sort of a raw sugar, which is similar to the less expensive sugars in the 18th century. I've got about a teaspoon of ground ginger. I've got some nutmeg. And the final ingredient, we need either brandy or rum. So I've got a rum here, which is a little bit more classic for a North American version of this. If we were doing an earlier English version, we would be using brandy. Here we're doing classic New England rum, right? So let's get these ingredients mixed up in here, and I'll start to whisk them up. Our drink is ready. It is ready. And if you're curious about that little piece at the end, you kind of really want to rewarm this drink up because you've poured it back and forth in a cool day, cold day like today. You want to warm this back up. So we used a toddy rod or a mulling poker, or it has a flip dog. Great bunch of great names. This one's made out of wrought iron. You heat this up in the fireplace, plunge it into your cold drink to warm it up. So that's what we used for that. But before this cools down, let's try out our heated up flip to see what it ends up tasting like. That is so good. When I first read this recipe, and I said, okay, so this is like 2/3 ale. I am not a fan of hot ale or warmed up ale. Mixed with the herbs, the sugar, the rum, this is incredible. This is truly, you could drink this all day long. This is so good. And warmed up, even better. I am just totally impressed by this drink. I can see why you see over and over in the 18th century references to this. There's this wonderful sort of diary where a person's talking about going into this tavern, like 2 or 3 times a week, and he's always drinking flip. So I can see why he was a great fan of this drink. These episodes here in the cabin, I just have so much fun with them. This is a wonderful place to sit down and cook. And I'm glad you were able to come along today as we sit by the fire and we try these things out, experiment and see exactly what it was like to sit in a cabin in the 18th century and make your food or make a drink. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today, special guest again, Michael Dragoo. We'll be cooking something, very interesting. Fried lobster. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Well, Michael, you brought this fried lobster. Yep. It's interesting. We don't eat fried lobster, do we?
I don't, but it's not to say you can't.
Most of the time,
we're about to try. So.
You boil the lobster, you take the meat out, either by yourself or it's done in some other way, and then we dip it in butter and done, right?
Right.
And lobster we think of as something you eat at a fancy restaurant.
In this time period, lobster is so everyday that it's only being fed to the prisoners on the prison ships in Baltimore, New York, Boston Harbor.
Yeah, lobsters are cheap in the time period and thought to be sort of like a trash fish, or they are kind of a trash fish, but a very inexpensive thing to eat. So obviously this recipe is kind of fun because she doesn't cook anything alike the way we would cook it.
No, she breads it and we fry it up, and then we've got a sauce that we put on it.
So she's covering it up. It up. So you going to read this one?
I can, I sure can.
Okay.
Elizabeth Cleland, 1755 from London. And to take a boiled lobster, take out the meat as whole as you can, slice it long ways, flour it, and fry it in clarified butter. And we're not going to do that. She says, or you may make a batter of cream, eggs, flour, and salt. Dip them in it, fry them. Here's the sauce. Then beat some butter up thick with grated nutmeg, claret, and orange juice. Lay the lobsters in the dish, pour the sauce on it.
So basically, it's like, how can we cover up lobster? How can we turn these into the fish sticks of the 18th century? So we boil that lobster, we take the meat out, we bread it, we fry it, and then we put a sauce on the top. Right. It's like ketchup, It's terrible.
Well, we're gonna find out.
So we're gonna ruin these lobsters, and I'll bet you it's gonna be great.
The citrusy, the claret, and the orange juice. I'm
so
we'll see.
We're gonna get these lobsters in some boiling water, and get them cooked up. So the lobsters are all cooked up. It's time to make the batter?
Yep, and it's simple. It's just flour, an egg, some heavy whipping cream, and some salt.
Okay.
So we're just going to make a well. Get our egg in here. Start to mix this up. A little bit of cream.
We're going to mix the salt in there?
Yeah.
You ready for some?
Yep.
There you go.
This is the only seasoning in this whole thing, so I would add a little more maybe.
Okay.
Thank you.
There you go.
We're just going to sneak up on this because I've really downsized the
And
amount.
we're looking for a thin batter.
Yeah, just something that's thick enough to stay on the
Yep.
on the lobster meat.
Okay. I can't believe we're going to put this slime on the outside of the lobster and then cook it up more.
Let's just wait and
Okay.
give it a taste here.
So the batter and the lobster are all ready to go, but we're not going to put them in yet because we don't want them to get all soggy.
Right.
The sauce, that's what we need to make.
The sauce is easy. It's butter, it's claret, it's an orange squeezed, and it's some nutmeg.
Yeah. So
if you wanted to slice and squeeze, I will get some butter in here. Now with these 4 ingredients, we just need to get it over to the fire and simmer a little bit.
they look fabulous.
Yeah, they do. They really do.
And the sauce is I mean, it smells good.
It's claret and butter.
Right.
How do you not? And your nutmeg.
How could you go wrong? So,
right.
I mean, breaded lobster. Let's
right.
find out how it turns
All
out.
right.
I mean, can you ruin? Well, you might be able to.
We're going to find out in a second. I like that. The saltiness of the breading.
Yeah.
You know, we cranked up the salt in there.
This is definitely cheating. You could probably do this with other things other than lobster, obviously.
Yes, good. This was worth the trial.
I think it is. I think it is. So good. This sauce adds definitely, I mean, it's got that major butter note, which is what we're looking for anyway.
Yep.
But then we've got that nutmeg and then orange juice in there, and
The
it
claret,
really,
the wine, the claret is, you know, it's not like Lambrusco. It's like a rosé. It's got that kind of back of your tongue kind of. It's wonderful.
yeah, it's truly wonderful. Now, is it
5
worth
stars
it?
here.
Is it worth it to take your lobster and do this with it rather than just dip it in butter?
Yep.
He says yes.
Yes. I'm voting with my mouth.
Now remember, the lobsters in the 18th century, they were cheap, inexpensive food, and you know, you could see them saying, and they might have even done this as a street food. I mean, they did that with oysters,
yes.
right? So like fried oysters, they would, you know, they might have, you know, fried. Can you imagine fried lobster street food? Yeah. You'd pick up a dish and, you know, just walk and eat with it like you would potato chips or something.
And lobsters were larger then. We hadn't fished them, outfished them, so this would have been larger pieces too.
Big pieces, yeah.
Home run on this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're going to be studying the food of the working poor, the most primitive of breads, the journey of the journey cake. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I've always been fascinated by the lives of the working poor, the downtrodden in 18th century America and other parts of the world. And when we look at their lives, we're immediately drawn to what their food, what their diet is like. And these things can be very difficult to research because poor people food does not make it into a fancy person's cookbook, does it? We only get descriptions of the food, and sometimes that's very, very scanty. But this particular topic, this idea of the simple breads that people eat in the 18th century, well, that we get over and over, wonderful descriptions, so we can really dig into this topic, and it's so much fun. So in North America, the classic simple bread is the cornbread or thirded bread sometimes made, or Ryan Injun bread that's sometimes referenced. And then we get the classic Johnny cake or journey cake. And these are simple, unleavened cakes of bread that are sometimes maybe cooked on a griddle, or they're cooked on a gridiron. They are a round, simple, like a puck of bread, right? Kind of hard, but very, very popular. They can fit in your pocket. You can warm them up by the fire, and they are simple to make. But are they invented in North America? No, they're an adaptation of a kind of food that we find in Europe, and specifically in Great Britain in the 18th century. Almost a direct connection or direct ancestor that we find back in Great Britain is the oat cake or even barley cakes. And these are very popular in Scotland, in Northern England, and in other parts of Great Britain. And how are they made? They're made out of the simplest materials. We just need flour, salt, and a little bit of water. And what's the last ingredient of bread? Leavening. Well, in this case, it's optional. We don't even need that. So let's talk about the grains for a second. Typically, when we're baking bread, we're thinking about wheat flour, but wheat in the 18th century is fairly expensive. And even if wheat grows in your area, you're more likely, as a poor farmer, to sell off your wheat and either to use your own homegrown or buy cheaper grains to use for your bread. So in Scotland, in Northern England, the inexpensive grain is oatmeal or oat flour. So they're gonna grind a fine oatmeal or oat flour. If you're in other parts, maybe barley is the grain that you're going to use for your inexpensive bread, or rye. In North America, again, wheat might grow in your area, but you're gonna sell that wheat, you're gonna export it, and you're gonna use corn instead. The classic meal that everyone uses. The problem is these grains, like oats, barley meal, and corn, they do not make a classic bread that wheat does. It doesn't have that gluten in there. It doesn't puff up and make this nice and fluffy bread. It makes a dense loaf. And those poor farmers, soldiers, sailors, they were used to this kind of very, very dense bread. Sometimes they even complained about that light and fluffy bread, say, it goes right through me. I need something dense with lots of energy in it. We've got our flour here already, and so let's mix up some dough so that we can cook it in a couple of different cooking methods that are mentioned multiple times, both here in North America and in Great Britain. So I've just got a good bit of flour here, and this is mixed. It's ground both very fine, and then there are some pieces in it that aren't so fine. You don't find a modern grind like this, but it's what you would get if you just did a quick grinding of yourself. And these grains were sort of hand ground in the area. Corn was pounded out in a mortar, and in Scotland they had little querns, little hand mills that they would mill out their own grain with. We've got some salt here. Almost all of them contain some sort of salt. You would only omit the salt if you didn't have any salt, or it had some other ingredient that gave you a salt-like flavor. Occasionally, something like alum might be used in your breads. We're going to mix that up when it's still dry. Let's go ahead and add some water. Nice and warm here. It's by the fire. That'll help us out. Let's see if I've got enough. So this mixture is looking really good. There are multiple variations of this kind of bread, and part of the variation is how thick you make the dough. And so, I mean, we can make a real thin batter that's almost poured out, or we can make a very stiff cake. This is something nice and in between, a nice soft dough here that we can work with, kind of sticky. We're gonna let it set just a little bit. Different versions, and we'll probably talk about this in a future episode, might be left for a greater period of time, but In this particular one, we're just going to leave this set for 10 or 15 minutes to sort of absorb that moisture. The mix looks good. These have sort of had time to rest them a little bit, and then I tore them up into little bits and made them into these little cakes. Very simple. They can be made in different sizes or shapes depending on what you need. And we're going to cook these in some of the most primitive ways possible. And what we've got here is a nice big flat stone. And I've heated this up on the fire. It takes a good while to heat this up. If they were a more well-to-do household, they might not use a stone, but they would use what we would call a griddle today. So not only are there multiple names for these little cakes, but there are multiple names for the pieces of equipment. They're so regional. Obviously we might call this, or the metal plate version, a griddle, but sometimes you see them, they call them a gurgle or even a girdle. So it's just really strange that you have all these different interesting names for the oat cakes themselves. So you might call them oat cakes, bannocks, yannocks, annocks. They had names like tharf cake or thar cake, which actually means hearth cake, right? And here, by the time they get to North America, they're called maybe bannocks, or they might be called the Johnny cakes or the Journey cakes. Our cakes are ready to try out, but I want to read to you this little piece out of William Ellis's Country Housewife Family Companion. This is 1750, one of the very best books of the time period to give us an idea about what a normal poor farmer's diet is like, what his life is like. And here's a little section where he's talking about oatmeal and oat cakes. Here they make, he's talking about northern England, here they make a vast consumption of oatmeal, having but little wheat growing in these parts. And with them they make cakes that supply bread by mixing oatmeal with water and a little salt. They knead it into a dough and batter and bake it like pancakes on a stone that has a fire under it. So that's just a very tiny little bit. It goes on to explain in several different places. Very similar cakes like this, unleavened little cakes. These are the oatmeal ones. These aren't Johnny cakes because they're not made with cornmeal, but exactly the same method of cooking. Making these little cakes, you can make a thin batter and bake it, make them like pancakes, or you can make little cakes like these. And these, because of the way the dough is made up and it's kind of aged a little bit, and because of the meal having different particle sizes, they're actually nice and soft, very sort of fluffy. And these are still warm, so steam is coming out of them. Now, many times they might make a year's worth or a half a year's worth of these ahead of time and let them dry out. And they'd come back and warm them by the fire and put butter on them or something like that to make them tasty. But these, just like this, right off the fire, a lot like a fire cake or an ash cake that a soldier would make, actually very, very tasty. Very savory. If you've cooked it on the stone with butter, well, then you get some of that butter flavor. But these are actually wonderful. A great experiment for you at home. If you want to try something out like this, just so simple. Make up these different, you can try out barley, cornmeal, rye meal, or the oat flour like this. You can cook them, on a outside with a fire like this, or even just sort of fry them up in a little bit of butter. Make these little cakes. A wonderful, interesting experiment. I really love these sorts of things, and perfect for camping. All you need to do is bring a little bit of salt and your flour, and you're going to have water with you already. So just a wonderful journey food. And if you make them up ahead of time, you can put them in your bag, carry them along with you, break them out, eat them whenever you need them. These oat cakes or Johnny cakes give us the perfect glimpse of what life was like for these just very, very common folk of the 18th century. The kinds of foods that you don't find in cookbooks, but that they ate every single day of their lives. Such a wonderful way to sort of walk in their shoes. I really want to thank you for coming along on this experiment. You know, it's not so much as a cooking episode as a history episode about this very, very simple food. Thanks for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we're going to be baking bread with wild yeast and bacteria. Sounds great, doesn't it? Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Bread has arguably been the most important food source for people for thousands of years. It was so very important in the 18th century, especially for those people in the lower classes, those working class folks in England, in North America. Super important to understand exactly what's going on with bread. So people in the urban centers, they had access to bread that was from the baker. So whether it was a inexpensive bread or an expensive bread, depending on what they could afford, bread was available in the urban areas. But out in the rural areas, bread wasn't as available, and especially what it takes to make bread that we typically consider yeast and barm that you would get from the brewer to make your bread nice and fluffy. And bread always has, or almost every bread has, basically 4 ingredients. It's flour, it's salt, it's water, and it's a leavening agent if it's a leavened kind of bread. So something like yeast. But what happens if you're in a rural area and you want to make bread but you don't have that available? That's the thing that I've been studying and trying to understand for a decade. And it's very hard to get this information because it's not something that's typically written about. It doesn't show up in cookbooks because it's low class food. It's made every day, and those folks, they don't write down their recipes, they just do it. And so what we're left with are descriptions of breads and descriptions of how they make them. Many times those people writing it don't actually understand exactly what's going on with the bread. But today we're going to dig down into where this comes from. A couple of weeks ago, I read from William Ellis's book about oat cakes. Remember the whole journey cake episode, which is an unleavened bread. But in that same section, here he says, by mixing oatmeal with water and a little salt, which they let stand together 20 or more hours, and then they knead it into a dough or batter. Multiple references here in William Ellis's book from 1750 talk about multiple different kinds of oat cakes, and one of those is a kind of bread that they called sour cake, and it was a dark loaf. It was sour, and it was probably leavened in this technique where they knead it together and then they let it set 20 or more hours. That's the hint here. What's going on in this 20 or more hours? Well, let's talk about that. Here are some doughs that I've made up earlier, and they have, here's one. This is just a standard dough lump, kind of made about the same consistency as you would do the bread itself. And then we let that set for, this has been setting for probably about 30 hours. And you can see it's starting to break up. It's starting to expand. It's starting to get all kinds of air bubbles. Look inside this. It doesn't have any yeast in it. Well, it doesn't have any yeast that I added as a particular ingredient. No barm. What has happened is this has got the yeast that is available in our environment. It's in the air, it's on my hands especially. It's in this dough bowl that I mixed the dough up originally. And you can see there's little pieces of dough that's left over, and that's on purpose. You don't clean your dough bowl out too much because it actually leavens the next batch. This is talked about in so many different books here in the 18th century, and you can even find references to that going on in the book of Exodus in the Bible, where it says the whole reason why they didn't have unleavened bread was because they couldn't get access to their bowls. That's what was leavening their bread. So this is what's going on in this. That the yeast that's available in our environment and even on the grain itself is doing the leavening action. And we can make a very wet version of this, a sponge, and that's talked about in these cookbooks also. Just they don't talk about it in this particular context of making a very primitive bread Many times they just talk about this in a yeasted bread, or one that uses what they called leaven, or the old dough technique, where you might start off with yeast, you make your bread, you take off a little piece, and you use that the next day or 2 days later, or even a week later if you store that in salt. So they had different techniques for making these inexpensive or kind of worker bread. So for us today, we know that what's happening here is that it's yeast, it's bacteria, it's all sorts of things in our environment that are making this happening. In the 18th century, they had not identified yeast, they had not identified bacteria, they just knew it worked. They called it leaven, they called it sour sometimes. They just, they would say it's sour dough, it's a piece of dough that's gone sour. Right? So they didn't know what was going on. They hadn't identified those little things that are happening in there, but they knew it worked. Now this dough is just simply a little bit of wheat flour, some rye flour, because that's kind of important, and it was one of the inexpensive grains in the time period, and then salt and water and mixed up into a soft dough. And this is in our dough bowl, so it's going to get some of that yeast from the bowl, might get some from my hands or from the flour itself. It's going to start percolating over time. We're gonna have to let this set though quite a while like this. And we wanna set it someplace warm. The dough bowl is perfect. It's wood, it's insulating, and we're gonna set it someplace warm. It's cold today. We're gonna set it close to the fire, not too close. We don't wanna bake it. So we've baked our loaf exactly like we made our farmer bread last year, and that is with our cast iron pot turned up over a nice warm stone, and then we can add some fire to the top of that to keep that nice and warm, and that will bake it just like you would, in a Dutch oven or actually in a larger oven, except we used a piece of equipment that almost every household would have. So the bread looks amazing. It's set up nicely. Has a wonderful, very, very interesting, not a standard, a bread out of the oven smell, but definitely a bit of a sourdough smell to it. And again, this is, no special thing, right? This was just dough that sat around for multiple, like a day and a half or so. Let's find out what it tastes like. Maybe I'm a little worried, but I don't know. Now this is bread that's freshly baked. Many warnings in the 18th century. Don't eat bread when it's still warm, when it's right out of the oven. Don't do it, it's bad for you. Well, we're gonna do it anyway because it's wonderful. It's got some amazing flavors to it, different than standard bread you're gonna get out of the store, obviously. This has got a little bit of rye in it. It's just other wheat bread other than that with a little bit of salt, and of course I just put a touch of butter on it. But the flavor is something that, boy, you just can't get any other way. It is very, very good. So again, this is bread that's made with just flour, salt, water, and then the yeast that comes out of the air in your hands from the flour itself. And anyone can do it. Anyone can try this out. Really just, mix up that dough, let it set for a day, 2 days, 3 days if you want to try it, and it'll do different things over that time. You can add flour to it, you can experiment with it. It's something everyone should try because it is just so fun and makes such a different bread experience that I think you're really going to enjoy. So I love episodes and recipes like this because we have to put together the pieces of the puzzle to understand what's going on with this simple, primitive bread that you're going to find in poor homesteads, on the frontier, all these places that, you just can't go to the baker and buy bread. And so many people were in that kind of situation. It's so interesting to, dig in on these topics. I just love them. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and we have a special holiday episode. We're going to be doing a Christmas goose. That ought to be spectacular and fun. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Goose is mentioned in a lot of the 18th century cookbooks. We're going to pick out this one. This is the English Art of Cookery by Richard Briggs. This is 1788 English cookbook. A great one, chock full of just really great recipes. The goose recipe is pretty simple. Some of them do something like they'll give you directions for a turkey and then say, oh yeah, do a goose like that. This one's specifically for goose, which is kind of nice. It's definitely goose. It's definitely different than trying to do this with a turkey or a chicken. The goose we've got to work with here is a pretty smallish goose. I'm not sure exactly how big theirs were in the time period, but I'm guessing that even in a time period fashion, this would be a smaller goose. We're supposed to truss this goose up. Pick it and wash it. We chop a dozen sage leaves, 2 large onions, some salt, pepper, and put them inside the bird. Then we put it down to the fire and we baste it. Sprinkle some salt on. We dredge it with flour, so we put flour over the top of it. It says a large goose will take an hour and a half, a small one about 1 hour. When it's done, baste it with butter, dredge it with a little more flour, and then it has directions for serving it to the table. And we'll cover that when we get done with this bird. So this bird we have already cleaned, got the vast majority of feathers off this. These geese can be very difficult to get all the feathers off. It's so nice when we go to a grocery store today and all our chickens are perfectly plucked. This one is off the farm, so it's we've got our own troubles to go with it, but we've basically cut off all the parts that we don't need for the roasting of it. And let me get this salt and pepper, these onions chopped up, put inside the bird, and we'll tie it up so we can hang it by the fire. I've got enough of our onions and sage to basically fill the cavity up here, although this is again, there's not a ton of meat on a bird like this. They're actually pretty hollow. There's a big cavity in here. So let's put some onions in here first. And then we'll put some salt and pepper in. And I'm just going to kind of put these in layers. Salt and pepper. Let's put a little bit of sage in there. We really want to have this cavity filled with something kind of like this. And I think that this is going to actually help it in a couple of different ways, along with the flavor of these onions, the salt and the pepper, sort of seasoning it from the inside out. So it'll be, well, I can't wait to try it. Sometimes birds are just seasoned on the inside with butter and salt and pepper. Goose is a naturally darker meat bird, so it probably doesn't need as much of the butter on the inside. This particular recipe doesn't call for any butter on the inside. Last little bit of salt and pepper. That looks really good. Now we just need to tie this bird up so that we can hang it by the fire. And what we're really just trying to do is both have a way to hang the bird and also to keep these the wings and the legs inside so they don't get burned. So step one, let's do this. I'm going to do this in a couple of different tie-offs because it's hard to do in one single throw here. I'm going to get these legs together. Just a simple square knot's going to hold those legs together, but I want to bring this whole tail end up all together. Okay, so that looks good. Now, the wings. There we go. That'll hold that together. Now we need to have sort of a fully surrounding piece so that we can hang this bird, and it continues to hold everything together so it'll cook nice and evenly all the way around. So we've got our birds strung up, and it's kind of at an angle to accept the heat as best it can. This method works really good for a campfire or a fireplace that doesn't have a lot of equipment, or if you don't have a reflector oven or whatever it takes. So it's a nice simple method, but it does take a little extra time because we can't get it quite as close. And if we want to catch drippings, which is always difficult with an open fire like this because it wants to burn our drippings away, we have to kind of build the fire up to one side and make it a little vertical. So I used a couple of fire bricks here to help make the fire higher, because it's always easy to cook things directly from the bottom, but not easy to cook it to the side. That's why a reflector oven would really help in this situation. So I'm keeping the fire up nice and high, letting this cook down. We do put, as this bird cooks, the fat from inside the skin kind of comes to the outside. We're supposed to keep a little bit of flour going on the outside of it, dredge it with flour. We don't need to butter it. That's one of the things that's kind of nice about this goose. There's so much fat under the skin, so it butters itself. And we're just gonna keep rotating this very slowly over the fire. If we have one little string here, we can wind it kind of up. We don't want it to spin fast, but nice and slow. It doesn't take very often that you need to kind of touch it, and it will keep slowly rotating. As the bottom cooks, because there's more heat at the bottom, we have to turn the bird over and kind of cook it for the other side. Occasionally you gotta kind of feel it, see if it's cooking everywhere. We might have to alter that string just a little bit. Again, we're gonna cook this. It might take, in this circumstance, a little bit longer because it's hard to get really close to the fire since it's on its string. Well, we garnished this up just like it called for, which is some beets and some lemon. So we got some red and yellow in there. We got to put a little kale in there with some green. If we're supposed to have gravy underneath the goose, and we made some gravies out of some of that, the drippings that came off of that, and it smelled tremendous. While it's cooking, a lot of those flavors or a lot of those smells go right up the chimney, but now that it's off the fire, whoa, you get all that great wonderful smell. So let's give this a try. Gravy is wonderful, that's for sure. And you could see as I was carving this that it's a dark meat bird, right? Like a duck. It's not anything like a chicken or a turkey with all this white meat on top. No, it's all dark meat. And of course, I really enjoy that. Not nearly so dry. So a nice tender meat. Although, a smaller bird like this, and especially a farmyard bird, they can be a little tougher to work with. So you got to kind of be used to that. Definitely a totally different experience than what we're used to. Chicken, turkey, totally different and very, very wonderful. Just you gotta try out something like this. If you can't find a goose, try a duck. If you can find those, usually those aren't nearly so hard to find, and probably almost as big as the one we were cooking here. Would be a great substitute. We've been talking about this one for so long, a Christmas goose. I'm so glad we were able to get it done for this season, and spectacular looking, amazing smells, wonderful flavors. So glad we were able to give this one a try. If you can't find a goose, look for a duck. Try this out. You can, roast it like we did over and over open fire, or you can do it in your oven at home. So wonderful. Try it out for Christmas. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we'll be cooking something that seems very, very modern, but has this rich, wonderful historical connection, and we'll be cooking with bacon, so it's got to be great. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's recipe comes out of the Housewife's Family Companion. This is William Ellis, 1750, an English cookbook. This is a lot of sort of cookery, and some of it is animal husbandry. There's medicine in this book. It's a lot of different information in it. There's a recipe here in the back or in the middle that is for, what's he call them? He calls them little bacon pasties that are boiled. Now, I believe that if I brought you a plate of these and I did not say where they came from, that you would say that I got takeout from a Chinese American restaurant, because these are going to end up looking a lot like a pot sticker or maybe even something like a wonton, depending exactly how you make them. But they're a very similar dish. And yet right here, they're English cookery, even English country cookery from the 1750s. Let me read you this recipe. Little bacon pasties to boil for a farmer's family. Mix a pottle of wheat flour with a sufficient quantity of warm water into a stiff paste. Roll it thinly out for making 6, 8, or 10 little pasties. This done, take a half a pound of bacon, cut it into very small, thin slices. Lay some on a piece of paste with a good store of parsley and thyme shredded small, to which you add a little black pepper and make it a pasty fashion. Proceed thus till all the paste in the bacon is made use of. Put them all into a pot of boiling water. Keep them boiling 3/4 of an hour with a quick fire. If these boiled bacon pasties are to be made better, use new milk instead of water with melted butter or lard. You may also, if you please, add up some chopped onions or any other relishing herb or root. So you get this wonderful recipe for these little boiled, he calls them pasties. There's an earlier recipe that's very similar he calls them dumpling, in that spot. It really kind of has to do with whether it's got a thin paste or a thick paste around the meat. And these are boiled up. They sure turn out really interesting, and I love the fact that he gives us some commentary here and some suggested alterations. So we're gonna have fun making up these little boiled pasties. Let's get started. So let's make up this very simple, I guess we would call it a dough. In the 18th century, it would be called just a simple paste. Obviously, we've got just some plain wheat flour here, like the recipe calls for. And instead of water, I'm gonna go ahead and make his richer version and add some milk into that and mix this around until we get a kind of a pie doughy kind of paste out of this. This dough looks good. I'm gonna go ahead and roll this out so that we can wrap it up into our dumplings, or pasties as it's called. We've got the dough rolled out nice and fine. We need to cut it into shapes that make these little pasties. And there's a couple different simple shapes that you'll see at least referenced multiple times. One is a little cup shape, and then there's the other shape that is sort of like a half moon, where you take a round little piece, you put the items in the center, and then you fold it over and seal it down like that. So in both those cases, we need little circles. So I'm gonna cut out some little circles out of this dough. Okay, the dough pieces are ready, and I've got the meat that we're gonna put in it. We also have a few other ingredients that they call for: parsley, a little bit of thyme, and I've got a little bit of salt and pepper also, along with just a touch of milk to help seal these up. So let's start off with this. We'll try a couple different shapes. We'll put a little bit of milk around the outside edge first. Let's go ahead and start off with a little bit of bacon on here. I'm not sure exactly how much we want to put inside this. It'll cook faster if we don't have it too full. There we go. A little bit of salt. That looks great. A little bit of pepper, or a lot of pepper in this case. A little bit of parsley, and just a touch of thyme. Here we go. Let's get this sealed up. This one I'm going to try to do a bit more like a pasty here. Four-sided top. There we go. We could probably fit a little bit more in than this one with this size. So these guys are ready for cooking. Now, in the same way that he gave suggestions for different kinds of meat to put in there, he also actually has two recipes, one right after the other, essentially the same, except one is boiled and the other ones are baked. So we're going to try these two different ways. We're going to basically take exactly the same thing. We're going to bake some right in our reflector oven right here by the fire, and we'll also have the ones going in the boiling water, so we can see how they turn out one way or the other. So let's get these going. There we are. We have the boiled dumplings, or pasties in this case, and the baked ones. And the baked ones actually turned out very nicely. You know, baking in that little side reflector oven worked out great. So let's cut these open. I'm really interested to see about how the interiors worked, especially on these boiled ones. The boiled ones are nice because you don't need to have an oven, and they can probably, it's hard to overcook them, right? I did get some air pockets in these. I think if I was going to redo them, I would make sure to press as much air out as possible because they kind of puff up as soon as they heat up. But we can try that. There we go. There's the look on the inside. You got to make sure these boiled ones seal really well. These, a little bit of water got in there. That's all right though. Let's find out how the boiled ones turned out. There we go. The meat is completely done. That tastes great. Spices, and even though a little bit of water got in there, still salt and pepper, the herbs, taste those, they taste great. Let's try one of these baked ones. I think I've got that one. That's ham. We don't want that. Let's see what's in this one. I can't remember what that. Oh yeah. Yeah, the baked one turned out great. You can see there. This one's bacon, just like the recipe. Smells wonderful because of the bacon in there. The bacon looks pretty done. Oh, that bacon one is perfect. I was kind of worried because, you know, when you don't cook bacon, say, you know, fried in a pan or whatnot, you're not sure whether it's completely cooked. Nobody wants kind of, you know, slimy cold bacon. Nobody wants to eat that. Cooked in this baked pasty, it was perfect, wonderful. All that flavor is trapped in there, just like the recipe mentioned. This baked one and both boiled and baked one, they keep the juices, the gravy in there that mixes with the crust, tastes wonderful. The flavors were wonderful. Earlier, I tried one of the beef ones. That turned out perfect. All the meat is cooked through. That recipe turns out perfect. If you don't have all the equipment you need, if you're just out in the camp, the boiled ones work out great. Great way to stretch the meat because you have all this dumpling or all this pasty that you have to eat also. And if you have access to an oven, you can bake them. Both of them turn out perfect. And another great addition, if we need just a little bit of sauce, a little bit of mushroom ketchup on the outside, that will really spice it up. I always recommend mushroom ketchup on a dish like this. If you like this one and you want something similar, a few years ago we did a larger beef pasty episode. Wonderful, try this out. Welcome to the 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're going to be cooking these wonderful potato pancakes, inexpensive, delicious. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Potatoes were a very important part of the diet in the 18th century in Great Britain and in North America. They were important, especially for the poorer sort of folks who didn't have those expensive foods available to them. Being wasteful, being efficient with your food was also incredibly important. They did not want to throw out their food. And beyond that, if you're eating lots and lots of potatoes, you want to mix it up. You want to have some variety in your food. So this is one of those ways you can either use leftover potatoes, or have some variety in your potatoes. Eating the same boiled potatoes over and over again, you want something different, don't you? So before we get started with the recipe, let's read it. In 1732, a man wrote a little pamphlet, and he talked about pruning fruit trees and potatoes. And he spent a lot of time talking about cooking potatoes. This is what he says. He says, the pulp of potatoes made into a paste or dough with a little milk and some salt, and then flattened into cakes and baked, is often used by some of the poorer sort of people when corn is dear, or when basically wheat flour is expensive, is what he means there. This little piece of text shows up in multiple different books. Shows up in Primitive Cookery here in 1767, almost 50 years later. So it's a very popular thing that was being used by a lot of different people. Now, they're baking these in this circumstance. We're going to be cooking these on the fire here with just a frying pan. We're just going to fry them up like you would do oat cakes and other items, especially the poor sort of people would do that instead of baking. So our first step is preparing our potatoes. I've got some pre-boiled potatoes sort of sliced up just like we used in the episode earlier this year. And we're just gonna mash these up. So we're mashing these up into a sort of doughy consistency. Now, these have cooled. They're not warm or anything. They're like your leftover potatoes. So they're gonna be a little thick. And that's why we have our other ingredients here. But we're just going to mash these so that they have a nice smooth consistency. Once we've got our potatoes into the right consistency, we can add a little bit of salt. And that's what we're going to do here. And then we add enough milk that we get into that sort of mashed potato consistency that we are expecting, something that we can form our little pancakes up into. And yes, it's basically, when we get done here, we just have mashed potatoes, right? Here they are. They might not be beautiful, but they smell amazing, cooking them right here on the fire. Of course, we get this wonderful wood smoke smell, but the potato cakes are smelling wonderful. We're gonna try these guys out. I sprinkled a little bit of salt and pepper, mostly pepper, up on top of those to give them just a little bit more. We could make a sauce with these. A butter sauce to go on top, if we had that. Tremendous. Oh. Yeah. Like a wonderful hash brown, except not chopped up into little pieces. Potato cakes are so good. An amazing 18th century way to be so efficient with your leftovers, or to give you variety in your diet when you only have potatoes to eat and you want to do something different with them. These turned out wonderful right out of the 18th century cookbooks. Love it. Hope you get a chance to try these out. So delicious, so inexpensive. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. I've got a special guest, Ivy, in the kitchen with me today. We'll be experimenting. We'll be trying to make wafers. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So we've got Ivy with us today. Ivy, are you excited about getting ready for Christmas? Yeah, so we're gonna make Christmas wafers. Well, let's hope we can make Christmas wafers. The wafer recipes that show up in the 18th century, they're all very similar. They're like a thin-ish pancake batter, right? So the problem is that most people do not have, I haven't heard anyone have good luck actually cooking them. And so many people will modify the recipe. They'll like make kind of a cookie dough and squeeze it between there and make wafer-like things, but they're not the wafer recipes that they show up in the 18th century. Now, this cookbook here is the Cooks and Confectioners Dictionary of John Knott. I think it's 1723, something like that. It's an early 18th century cookbook. It's got 4 recipes. 4 wafers in it, 4 different recipes, and they're all very similar. And here's the first one as an example. Put the yolks of 4 eggs on and 3 spoonfuls of rose water to a quart of flour, mingle them well, make them into batter with cream and double refined sugar, pour it on very thin and bake it on irons. So it's a rich recipe. Egg yolks, not just eggs. It's got rose water. That's an expensive aromatic that you're putting in there. It's got flour, and it's got cream instead of milk, and double refined sugar. That means white sugar, not a brown sugar. But the fun part of this recipe is it says bake it on irons. That's it. That's it for the technique, which is what everybody has trouble with. Making the batter is nothing. Anybody can do that. So here's the second recipe. If you can see this, there's a first recipe. It's just like 3 lines, 4 lines long. Here's the next recipe. It's half the page. And it's a very similar recipe at the beginning, but the last 3/4 of that giant page of text is about how to do it. So that's what we have to learn, not making the recipe, but how do we actually make these wafers?
So the ingredients we're going to be using today are a pint of cream, 2 egg yolks, and probably around a cup of flour, and a half a cup of white sugar. And the first thing we're going to do is mix our wet ingredients.
So let's start getting this mixed up. We're going to start off with our wet ingredients. Here, you go ahead and take this because you're going to do all that hard work. We just want the egg yolks. There you go. You can whisk that up. Very nice.
Add the cream in.
Yeah, so we've got a pint of cream. You know it's going to be good if it's got a pint of cream in there. Whisk that up very nicely. Now that that's, whisked up enough, I mean, we really probably want that a lot more whisked up, but we'll let Ivy keep going on that. Then we're going to put in some sugar. Off you go. Now, many of these recipes had the aromatic rose water or orange flower water shows up. Also, now today we wouldn't use something like that, but if we did want something similar, we would add in a little bit of vanilla, and that gives us our aromatic. We might add a little bit of orange flower water for the fun of it, but I'm not so sure.
Is that about good?
Yeah, that's gonna start going. Just keep on whisking. I'm gonna add flour in as we go. And again, we don't know exactly how much flour. Most of these recipes do not have amounts. They're very sort of add these 2 things together. So we're just gonna add flour in until we get to the right kind of consistency.
What's the consistency that we're looking for?
Well, some of the recipes call for a very thin batter. Other ones call for something like a pancake batter, and then they add more things to thin it out a little bit. So but of course, we don't know exactly what their pancake batter thickness is. Ours tends to be kind of a fairly thick batter, but we're going to go for something, we're going to shoot for something pretty thin. Well, it's pretty thick. It's probably thicker than what they called for, and I don't want to cheat and make this too thick. I want to make it exactly like the directions as much as possible. So we're going to add a little bit of water in here to thin it up. Some of the later recipes, the almost 19th century recipes, say to have a little warm water set aside that you can add in to thin it. So you don't want it to be too thick. These recipes are great fun to read. They're hilarious. One of these recipes is like, well, you know, mix the cream in the flour and then add more cream and then add more cream later on. So they're always fun. And we are definitely looking for something that, as it splashes up onto the sides, you can see, you can kind of get an idea of how smooth the texture is. And we want a very, very smooth texture on this. So and sometimes it says to beat this a long time. And that's just to get everything smooth, not necessarily to beat air into it, because we don't actually want it to bubble a whole bunch. We want it to be a smooth wafer. Well, the consistency looks right, so it needs to sit a little bit. Actually, though, there's one thing that's missing. This is an 18th century recipe. Most of the recipes, well, 2 of the recipes out of the 4, one had mace and the other one had nutmeg.
Well, you have to put the nutmeg in.
Right, so we're gonna, and I think, boy, one of them, it was like a half on nutmeg. They wanted a lot of nutmeg in there to go along. And it is an aromatic too, just like that orange flower water and the rose water. There we go. And you can whisk that in. And then we'll let this kind of get smoother, kind of settle down a little bit. Now comes the tricky part. We have to get the irons ready. We got to get the fire ready so that we can start to cook them. So here is the irons that we're going to be baking in, and they've got this nice design in them. This is actually an old set of wafer irons, probably from the late 18th century, early 19th century. You know, it's been cleaned up here so that we can use them. Beautiful design on the inside, nice heavy platters to hold that heat. And well, the interesting thing I think about this, one of the things about this recipe is that it is an expensive recipe in that it's got expensive ingredients. It's got expensive equipment that you have to have so that you can bake them. And they're something that takes some finesse, some real time to bake. So these are obviously something for a fancy household because of expensive ingredients, expensive equipment, and all the time it takes to make these fun little wafers. So I'm gonna get this on the fire to start warming up. They need to be probably around 300, 350 degrees hot before we start to put the batter in. The recipe also calls for a simple small ball of butter inside of the corner of a napkin to help butter your irons. Our wafer iron is almost up to heat. You would think you'd just pour that batter on there and everything would turn out all right, but that's not what I've heard, so let's read the directions. Having your wafer iron ready heated, rub on both sides from time to time with fresh butter put into the corner of your napkin. So that's what we got here. Turn the batter upon the iron, not exceeding 1.5 spoonfuls for every wafer. Lay the wafer iron on a furnace. Now what we got here is a little trivet to hold that just over our coals, which would be like a little furnace or a little stove, sometimes it's referred to here. So that when the wafer is baked on one side, it may be turned upon the other. Open the iron a little and observe. If it come to a good color, it is enough. At that instant, you don't want it to burn, right? Take off the wafer from the iron with a knife, rolling it a little around the same. Then, last of all, spread the wafers hot upon a wooden roller made for the purpose to shape them and set them in a stove so that they may be finished and that they may be kept dry. So it's very complex, isn't it? It can't be that hard, right? So we're going to figure this out. We've got our wafer iron up to heat. And we're gonna try spooning some of this on there and start to get these guys cooking. Oh, okay.
That's not gonna work.
So, I don't know if you could get more of a failure than that. It didn't do anything. There's nothing left. It all just boiled away. So, okay, that isn't gonna work.
Nope.
Now what? Okay, so I got what was left of that wafer off of there. I think it was too hot. And of course, the first time you try to cook one of these and you got too much butter on there, that's a problem too. So, I'll let these cool off just a little bit, and Ivy, come in. Let's try another one right now. Okay, that's good. Okay. Well, there's more of it left than there was last time, but
yeah.
But it's. I mean,
It's kind of gooey.
That's not a wafer.
No, that's not a wafer.
That's like a lace doily. So, okay, that's not going to work.
Nope.
So we could try thickening the batter, but that would be cheating. So we're going to let this cool down a little bit more, and maybe I'm not going to like slam it closed right away. So go ahead and let's try some in it, and then wait a second. Although the directions don't say that. Okay, so let's wait and see what happens.
Yes.
And now I'm going to try it over the fire. So that one was slightly better. The doily was a little thicker, but obviously we're not there yet. It feels to me like maybe it's the pressure that is squishing all the material out.
You just need to barely lay it on there.
So I think that's what I'm going to try maybe this time. That's good. Whoa, not too much. I'm just going to gently put it on the fire. Just slowly do it.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Well, 2 hours later, and I think we've got it figured out. It took a lot of trial and error on this, and it seems to me that, I mean, it almost seems like it's just time. You just have to spend a whole bunch of time, and I'll bet you every time we'd come to this, the first half an hour, you think, what? It's not working, it's not working. And you just keep working at it. I think part of it is the batter rusting. And part of it is the irons getting into the groove and you getting into the groove exactly how much time it takes. I guess the real trick is to put that batter in there and not close them up real quick. Let them kind of slightly cook for a second. And then when you close it, you very gently close it. Because if you squeeze it at all, it just squeezes out and turns into
lace
doily. So let's try them out.
Yeah.
They look great, so let's try them out. We got a little bit of whipped cream. We've got a little bit of jam here, and I'm gonna try mine without any first.
I can pick this up here.
Reminds me of a modern vanilla wafers, right?
Right.
Although there's no vanilla in here, I think it's that egg flavor. You get. I don't know if this one had very much nutmeg in it. Let me find one that I know had lots of nutmeg. We might have to add some to our thing. But a little bit of whipped cream. Oh wow! With the topping, they're tremendous. And
that jam is
well, holiday preserves, whip topping. They're fun. They certainly are a fancy little thing, perfect for the holidays. I'm not sure how you would do them in a modern kitchen without a set of irons.
Yeah.
But they're so much fun, and they look really neat. If you're interested in this cookbook, this John Knott's cookbook, I think this is the one that had fried chicken in it too. Amazing cookbook from early 18th century with a lot of different kinds of recipe. It's a little bit harder to read. It's got earlier text font style, but it's still such a tremendous cookbook. This one's available on our website. You can make sure to check out the description. Ivy, thanks for doing all that work with the whipping it up and trying these out. Of course, everybody wants to stick around for the end to try them out,
Yeah.
so thank you for that. Thank you guys for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're doing amazing 18th century chicken wings. I don't even believe it. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. The recipe is in The Professed Cook by Claremont. This is actually sort of an interpretation or translation of an earlier French cookery cookbook. And this one, the title, at least the English title, is Chickens Without Art. I believe the French title was probably more closely Chickens the Easy and Friendly Way, right? And we think of maybe chicken wings that way, although they don't call them chicken wings. Cut off the wings of 4 middling chickens, flatten them with the handle of a knife, marinate them with salt and pepper, chopped parsley, green shallots, mushrooms, and a little good oil. Then put them in a stew pan separately with the marinade on a good brisk fire. Turn them soon. They will require only a quarter of an hour to do so. Take the wings out. Lay them on a dish that you intend for the table. Add 2 spoonfuls of cullis to the sauce. Skim it well. When ready, add a good lemon squeeze and serve upon the meat. So it doesn't necessarily, maybe sound like, basically barbecued chicken wings like we might be expecting today, but it's gonna probably end up something like that. Very, very interesting recipe. Most of the recipes you'll find in English cookery cookbooks don't talk about specific parts of the chicken. They generally tend about cooking the whole entire chicken. So I thought this one was quite interesting in that they are talking specifically about chicken wings and kind of doing them in a fancy way. So this is probably kind of really close to the reason why and what we do with chicken wings today. We need to start with our marinade first. We've got parsley. I've already chopped up a good bit of parsley here. We're just gonna put it in our large mixing bowl. Mushrooms, chop those up in a nice medium kind of size. We're gonna put a good bit of mushrooms in there. They make a great component of this marinade. We've got our green onions, or they call for green shallots in that recipe. So either one of those is gonna work fine. I'm gonna go ahead and put salt and pepper in the marinade, and we'll also put them on the chicken wings. But let's go ahead and put a little salt and pepper in there. There we go. And now we've got our good oil. You can use whatever standard cooking oil you like to use. And we're just gonna pour a good bit of that in here. And now let's get it nice and mixed up so it can start marinating. We're gonna set this aside and we're gonna start working on those chicken wings. Got them here. And obviously the author of this was worried about the chicken wing being flat enough so that when it was cooking, it didn't have pieces that were sticking up like that. So we want to make sure that our chicken wings are nice and flat. We can take our back of our knife and just make sure those are flattened out. And usually it's this small joint that we can flatten out a bit. Now for a little salt and pepper on the outside of these chickens. So our chicken wings are now buried in this nice marinade, and we're gonna set this aside maybe an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, so that all those flavors can mix together nicely. Then we can start to cook them. Well, here they are. They're amazing. They look great. While cooking them, they scented the kitchen the perfect way. They just smell wonderful. And so at the end of this process, we took the chicken wings out. We left the, all that marinade in the pan. We added some broth to that and sort of made the gravy, just like the directions said. And that came back out and went on top. So it looks like it's going to be great. I can't wait to try these guys out. We're going to go ahead and just pick up one of these. Whoa! The flavors are tremendous. That lemon comes in, it does, right up on top. Gives you that wonderful sort of acidic, spicy flavor that really adds a tremendous quantity to this. Now the real question is, what's the rest of this gonna be like? Well, not just the chicken wings themselves, but the sauce that came on top. Those mushrooms are tremendous. Everything cooked down into this just really, really tasty sauce. All that wonderful, salt and pepper in there. And then all the spices, or all the wonderful flavor that comes in with the onion and the mushroom. This is just one of those, you've got to try it, because it is such a wonderful way to cook a very inexpensive meat cut, chicken wings, but yet it's, it's like 10 stars. This is really good. Another thing to remember about this recipe is that it's so very, very simple. I mean, it has actually kind of few ingredients, very simple ingredients. The prep time is very short. If you already have chicken wings to work with, I mean, you just basically mix this up and set it aside. So it only has 5 minutes of prep time, and then, 15, 20 minutes of cooking, and it's done. So it is a very fast and very good recipe. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we're going to be cooking something simple, something that's common to us, pancakes, but with a historic twist. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's recipe is from the lady's assistant, Charlotte Mason. This is 1777, and this is an English cookbook. But the title of the recipe is New England Pancakes. So that's our weird hint today. Why is it called New England Pancakes? Let's look at the recipe itself. A pint of cream, 5 spoonfuls of flour, 7 eggs, leave out 3 whites, a little salt, fry them thin in fresh butter, lay 7 or 8 in a dish, strew butter and cinnamon between. So this is a really interesting recipe in that it's in a bunch of other pancake recipes. There's 7 or 8 pancake recipes in this particular cookbook. If we want to go digging deeper in on New England pancakes, we could pick up something like American cookery. This is a New England cookbook from 1796. No pancakes at all in this particular cookbook. So sometimes we got to go to another hint for exactly what New England pancakes were like. So let's get started on this one. I've got all the ingredients here. We've got flour, obviously. I've got a pint of cream. We've also got a little bit of salt. Other than that, we just need the ingredients for the sort of topping that goes in between. So a little bit of ground up sugar, and we've got some cinnamon. And of course, what are we going to cook these in? I'm going to cook these in just a little bit of butter. And we'll need about 7 eggs for this recipe. So let's get started putting this together. Probably the simplest way is not the order that the recipe is in, but we're going to start with the eggs because those take the separating, and that's the most efficient way to deal with this. First, we need just 3 yolks. And I'm going to go ahead and take the number of eggs down to 6 because our eggs are undoubtedly much bigger than their eggs were in that time period. So to balance that out, you could even go all the way down to 4 or 5. Now we just need 3 whole eggs. Now let's whisk these up with our birch twig whisk. So next let's add in our cream. And we can whisk this up till we get that all incorporated. Doesn't take that long. This looks really good. Now we can start to add in our dry ingredients. And we don't have very many dry ingredients. I'm going to start off with our salt here. And this is kind of a big recipe, so I'm going to put a full teaspoon of salt in there. Now we need the flour. We need 5 spoonfuls of flour. And this is another one of those fun parts of the recipe where you say 5 spoonfuls. What do you mean 5 spoonfuls? Think of it as a cooking spoonful, right? So that's what we're going to shoot for. It might be a tablespoon, more or less, but that's what we're going to shoot for here. And also I whisk these in a little bit at a time. I'm not just dumping the whole amount in there so that I can whisk it in and get it nice and smooth, because we don't want it to be lumpy. If it's lumpy, we just have to keep whisking it until we get it smooth. It's always helpful when we're in the flour part, we're not sure exactly how much. Really, you're just shooting for consistency, right? Is this a pancake batter consistency? Yes or no? This is probably a runnier, and some of these 18th century pancakes are definitely runnier than what we would think of as a typical American pancake today. And so you want it to be a little thinner than that. And also, what's missing from a modern pancake recipe, this doesn't have any leavening. It doesn't have any chemical leavening like baking soda, baking powder, none of that is in here. So these make thin, flat pancakes. Today we might call them crepes, but that's the kind of typical pancake from the 18th century. I'm gonna let this batter rest just a little bit, and I'm gonna get the fire ready and the pan hot. There we go, our pancakes, they're ready to eat. I made a giant pile just for the camera so you can see those. But I'm gonna eat these other ones. They didn't turn out quite so pretty here, but I've got them on the side. Now, obviously, this is an English woman's take on a New England pancake, isn't it? Because what's missing? Obviously, a New England pancake, it's gonna be smothered in maple syrup, but they didn't have the maple syrup in England, so they used what they thought was the equivalent: sugar, cinnamon. It's probably still gonna be really good, isn't it? So let's try this one out. Well, you know what? It ends up being dry. I expect maple syrup, don't I? I expect that extra liquid in here and making it nice and moist. Now these turned out nice and fine. I didn't overcook them, which is easy to do with these little thin pancakes. So I cooked them. It took a little while, but they're very, very tender. Not quite as bready as our, modern pancakes might be today. So I really enjoy their texture. The cinnamon and the sugar is definitely a different take. A standard English take would be, at least in the 18th century, would be the sugar and lemon juice on top. So the cinnamon definitely is a little different. But again, boy, if I had my druthers, I would be putting some maple syrup on these. Or you could, if you want to go in a kind of a mix, you would put on a pudding sauce, wouldn't you? With the butter melted, with sugar, and a little wine in there. Oh, it would make a wonderful substitute for maple syrup. So good. This reminds me of a recipe in the same cookbook, which is the pepper pot recipe. Now that's a West Indian recipe that's translated into the English, and it's definitely an English take. This is an English take on New England pancakes, not exactly like really you would have if you were in New England. Same way with the pepper pot. Such a fun recipe, a simple recipe, an easy to do one. It's great to try this one out. You can try it out with the cinnamon sugar. You'll love it. It definitely, the takeaway on this is watching what happens when those different colonial foods come back to the mother country and how they get reinterpreted, changed around, and how things move from one region to another. So it's a real interesting recipe and a real interesting cookbook for that specific idea. If you're interested in historical cookbooks, make sure to check out our website. We've got dozens and dozens of historical cookbooks from the 18th century. Thank you so much for coming along today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we're going to be cooking some amazing beef ribs. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Roast beef cookery of the 18th century. It's classic, especially classic English cookery. You can find lots of different directions for that. Today I'm going to be working out of, this is Madame Johnson's Instructions for a Young Woman, 1755. There's a section of that book just on cooking that she calls the Cook Maid. The rules for roasting. Make your fire in the first place in proportion to the joint you dress, be what it will. But whether small or large, let it be clear and brisk. If your joint be larger than ordinary, which this one kind of is, take care to lay a good fire to cake. So we want lots of coals. When you imagine your meat half done, move the spit and the dripping pan some small distance from the fire, which you must then stir up and make it burn as brisk as you can. For observe, the quicker your fire, the better, the more expeditiously will your meat be roasted. And then right under that, there's to roast ribs of beef. That calls for a little special technique that I want to cover later on. But today we're going to be just using these generic roasting directions. We're going to be working on these ribs. Let's get started. So we don't want to use a spit with these ribs. It's really hard to get them to stick to a spit. So we're using our hanging meat hook. Perfect for this particular kind of cut that we want to hang up. We've also got a dripping pan here, and it does call for, in different parts of those directions as you read further on down, basting with water and salt, and of course the drippings that come off. If you need more moisture and you're concerned about that meat drying off, some of those recipes also add butter, even specifically on a ribs recipe, making sure you've got plenty of moisture there. You don't want them to dry out. I don't want this to cook too fast, so I'm not going to get this too close to the fire or build up the fire too quickly here at this beginning part. As she says in those directions, this first half of the cooking, kind of nice and low and slow. And then at the end, we'll build up that fire, we'll bring it a little bit closer. But right now we need space underneath anyway for this basting pan. We'll probably build this fire up with some little pieces right toward the end. So this piece of meat like this is a little bit challenging in this situation because it's going to want to cook on one side more than the other, and of course on the bottom more than the top. So we do have to occasionally take this off, rotate it around to keep the heat even on this. Pretty soon I'll probably flip it front to back Also, we so have to keep the drippings whenever possible. This is an important part of the cooking process. This is the gravy. In 18th century terminology in the cookbooks, when they say, you know, capture the gravy, talk about gravy, the meat drippings themselves, not what you do with them afterwards, but the meat drippings themselves are the gravy that comes from the meat. Sometimes you might even slit it to cause more of it to come out. We want to keep as much as possible because we want these to be, not dry. We want them to be as moist as possible. So we're capturing them. We also have a little bit of water down in this pan, and I've added some salt, and we'll baste these a few times to help bring this moisture back up to the top so we don't lose it. Well, here's our finished product. It smells amazing here in the cabin. It just, this wonderful ribs smell all over the cabin along with the firewood. Wow, it just doesn't get any better smell-wise, and it just looks amazing on that, in front of the fire. It's time to try this out. It came right off of the bone, easy. Cut it up into some little pieces here. Amazing beef flavor. So good, so good. Beef ribs like this are so good on the open fire and cooked so simply. I mean, all you need to do is baste it every once in a while with the salt water and the gravy that comes off of that. And of course, if we were cooking a different dish, we would use that gravy and right here along with it, or we can store that gravy and keep it for tomorrow or next week because it's got so much wonderful flavor in it from these ribs. Such an easy, wonderful way to cook right here in the fireplace. So good. So here we are in the cabin, and we have just the most simple tools to use, but it's perfect for this recipe. It is simple. It's just like what they would have been eating, and it is, basically you can't get any better than this. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we'll be doing, it's going to be a special holiday treat. This recipe is it a donut? Well, I'm not really sure, but it's going to be good, I bet. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Our recipe is from the Lady's Assistant, Charlotte Mason. This is 1777, one of the cookbooks that we publish. This one is in the pancake section, which I thought was fun and interesting. It's the last of the pancakes, which is not a pancake at all. It's called a German puffs. Now, when I first read this and I went straight to the bottom, I thought, this is a donut. But then as soon as I kind of read it a couple times over, I said, oh, maybe not. Put a pint of milk into a stew pan, dredge it with flour till it's very thick. Stir it over a slow fire till like a paste. When it is cold, beat it well with the yolks of 8 eggs, 4 ounces of sugar, a little brandy, some nutmeg, the rind of a small lemon grated till it's very light. So whip it or beat it till it's very light. Drop this with a large teaspoon into a pan of boiling lard. If well beat, they will rise exceedingly. Drain them. Serve with melted butter, wine, and sugar in a boat. So the bottom part here, serve with butter, wine, melted sugar, and sugar. That obviously is a pudding sauce that we recognize right away. But the reason why we kind of come back and say this isn't a donut necessarily is because of what happens here with this batter. At the beginning, it turns out that it's just like the puff. When we made a cream puff earlier this season, we made a choux, a paste that's made with this flour, and you cook it until it's hard like a paste, then you add other things and beat it. Well, it's exactly what's going on with this one. So it's a puff. So let's look at the ingredients. So we start off, we've got milk, We got about a pint. Now we're gonna half this recipe because I don't need a billion of these donuts lying around. Can't take that. We've got also white flour, and that's what we're gonna start this off with. As soon as we've got our paste kind of made up, then we've got egg yolks that we're going to add in. We've got some brandy, some sugar, a little bit of lemon rind, and of course, it's an 18th century recipe. It's got to have nutmeg in it, right? So let's get started. The first thing we're gonna be working on here is this dough batter, whatever we wanna call it here. It's got a couple different stages. First, we're gonna start off the fire. We start off with, again, I'm gonna half this recipe, so about a cup of milk, and we're gonna add flour until it starts to get thick-ish. So I got my whisk here, and we're just gonna add flour in. I could do this right on the fire, but I would worry about kind of burning this milk, and you do have to be careful with it. It says thick. I don't want to get it too thick. This is looking pretty good. It's thick. It's not like paste yet. We'll know, at least when we were doing the other puff recipe, you would know when that batter started to peel off the sides of your cooking vessel. So let's get this on a low fire and I'll keep stirring it. So we've got a very paste-like mixture here in the pan. You can see very, very thick. Now we're gonna add our other ingredients. But first off, we need some egg yolks. I'm gonna go ahead and start off with just 3 egg yolks because our eggs are, well, they're huge. And I'm sure their eggs were probably a little bit smaller. We also have some brandy. It doesn't say how much brandy. So I'm just gonna use about a jack's worth of brandy here. We don't probably need a lot. If you don't wanna use brandy, you probably don't need to add it at all. You might mix in yet another egg yolk if you just need the liquids. And I've got our lemon zest that's gonna go in now. Calls for sugar, 4 ounces. We only need 2 ounces because we're doing a half quantity. And this really is kind of a 2-taste thing, so. And what's left? Got our nutmeg. There we go. That's great. A little nutmeg in there. Very good. Now we've got to get this all mixed, and it says beat it. So we are, in theory, trying to get some air into this maybe? I don't know. I'm not so sure. So I'm just gonna whip this well with our whisk until it really starts to smooth out. Because that paste was in little hunks, it takes a good bit of beating before it smooths out. Okay, this is whisked up nicely. It's smooth, looks good. I'm sure they'll puff up nicely when they go in the oil. And the oil I have had warming up this whole time, and it is just to the right temperature right now. I kind of moved it out a little bit and down so it warmed up even more, so the oil is ready. And you can check that by, well, you can kind of look at the surface of the oil and kind of see a shimmer. If you take a little split of wood and stick it in there like a little matchstick, if it bubbles, you're good. The oil is ready. So let's get some of this in the oil. Here we go. Our German puffs are ready to try out. I went ahead and put the pudding sauce over the top of them, which is a simple sauce, butter, and then sack, or let's say a sherry wine, and then sugar. Mixed those together up until they melt, and that's it. And you just got to keep stirring it. Poured that over the top. Let's give them a try. they've puffed up nicely. A lot of nice air holes in there. And depending on how you make this paste, they can really puff up. So much so that as they cook, they'll burst open and cook more. So that worked out really well. And even if you try these without the sauce, you can help to get all those flavors. The lemon zest really comes through, a little bit of nutmeg in there. And the dough itself, even without the sauce, turns out to be kind of sweet. So it's a nice thing, but then you add the pudding sauce. That takes it right over the top. So is this a donut? Not quite. Certainly a little different. If you look at the period recipes for donuts, and there are some definitely leavened differently than this. This is a simple egg leavening, sort of, well, like a popover. Those eggs, you know, puff up in there, and they make it very, very airy. These turned out exactly that same way, but cooked in a totally different way. And this pudding sauce, a typical English take on the way you're gonna sweeten this. So love this recipe, love this recipe. Hope you get a chance to try it out. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today's recipe popped out of the cookbook. It was so interesting. Mutton Kebabs. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So sometimes when we think about English cookery in the 18th century, we think plain cooking. You know, we think, in our terms today, meat and potatoes. But that's not necessarily always true. There were a lot of influences coming into English cookery in this 18th century, a lot of French cookery coming in, but this one popped out because it's something from, you know, much deeper into the continent, Persian area, Turkey, that kind of a thing. So mutton kebab is just like, what is this doing in this cookbook? I have to read up on this. Did a little bit of digging. It looks like it starts to show up in these English cookbooks in the 1760s. So the first one that I've got here is Elizabeth Raffald. This one's the experienced English housekeeper, 1769. Now, let me read this one. Mutton kebabed. Cut a loin of mutton in 4 pieces, take off the skin, and rub them with the yolk of an egg. Strew over them a few breadcrumbs and a little shredded parsley. Turn them round, spit them, roast them, and keep basting all the while with fresh butter. Sounds good, doesn't it? To make the froth rise. When they are enough, put a little brown gravy underneath them, serve them up, garnish with a pickle. Now this is this particular recipe is probably the plainest of them, and kebabs were supposed to be fairly spicy. So I'm going to be adjusting it and using Hannah Glass's recipe that is a little more complex. I won't read that one to you. We won't do every single thing in that recipe, but these are so interesting for, you know, different ones coming in and different ideas coming in, and how this influence came into Great Britain. How did these ideas, how did this particular dish, and why this particular dish, why did this come into the culture? Such really interesting questions, but let's cook the food. So to start off with, we need a breadcrumb mix. We're using the Hannah Glass recipe here. We are going to add in some breadcrumbs. She does not call for any particular amount, obviously. We've got some breadcrumbs there. Instead of putting the salt and pepper in her breadcrumb mix, we're gonna put that on the meat itself, but she calls for sweet herbs. In the earlier recipe, the Raffald recipe, she just calls for shredded parsley, but here we've got sweet herbs, we've got some mint, we've got some rosemary, and some thyme. And I also picked this recipe because Hannah Glass has nutmeg. Okay, this is our breadcrumb mix. That's done. We can set that aside. We need to have an egg wash to stick to the meat so that all this breading sticks up there. Hannah Glass calls for 3 eggs. It's kind of funny when the recipes like this actually are specific about one particular thing. She says 3 eggs, nothing else is measured. So, you know, you could have 10 pounds of meat or 1 pound of meat. Doesn't make any sense, but that's the fun part of some of these. So our egg wash is ready. That's all that's gonna take. Now let's add some salt and pepper to the meat. It just says to lightly salt and pepper it, so we're not gonna go crazy with that. There's our salt, there's our pepper. I'm gonna set that aside, kind of make sure that gets coated. Looks good. And let's talk about the meat just for a second. The recipe calls for mutton, which shows up in these 18th century cookbooks. A lot of mutton gets eaten in the 18th century in Great Britain. Not any of that is available here to any great extent. Here in middle America, mutton is just not on the menu. You can't find it in the grocery store. What we've got here is lamb, and that does show up sort of seasonally. So I've got some lamb. It's already chunked up for something like a lamb stew, which is exactly what they already did in the cookbook. They said, cut up these little cubes of mutton. So that's what we're using for our mutton today, some lamb. So let's coat these pieces. These smell wonderful, just getting ready to cook. The recipe calls for a small spit. We're gonna put them on these little metal skewers. I can't wait to get these on the fire. Here they are, they smell great. They've been cooking this whole time. It's been killer waiting for these to get off the fire because we wanted to eat these up. They smell great. I'm gonna try this. Now gravy was in the recipe and it's like pour gravy over it, but we're gonna try it without the gravy first because that would be totally cheating. So good. The lamb mixed with the spices, with the breadcrumbs and the butter poured over the top, right? And then the drippings that come off of it, put back onto it again. Tastes just really good and very interesting mix with the lamb. That's not typical for at least this area. Super, super good flavor. And lamb is the classic dish for these kebabs, or at least mutton, right? This is just wonderful. You can make these probably with other things very easily. It'd be great if you did it with beef or with pork or with chicken, whatever. But if you get a chance to try it with the lamb, I really suggest that. Now let's find out this little bit of gravy here. The gravy was drippings, mushroom ketchup is what the recipe called for, a little flour to thicken it up because they wanted a thick gravy. That's really good too. That is really good too. So good. I'm so glad we got a chance to do this one. So interesting to see these different cultures affecting English cooking in the 18th century. An important recipe to check out. If you get a chance, definitely try this one out, especially if you can do it over an open fire. You will enjoy it, I promise you. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we're going to be cooking something that you would find on the very richest table and the poorest table. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Potatoes were so incredibly important for food in the 18th century, especially for poor people. Of course, they were popular in Ireland during the 18th century. They're also popular in Scotland and other parts of England. Scotland and most of England, potatoes were not part of the tithe or a tax, so that they could grow, poor people could grow potatoes, and they didn't have to worry about them being taxed away. There was no, it was sort of an incentive item for the poor. It's like, you guys can go ahead and grow these. We're not going to tax you on them. So that's how they were so important for the poor, and they're very easy to cook. They show up, of course, in lots of cookbooks, very high-end cookbooks. So they are part of a rich person's table as well as a poor person's table. This little cookbook, Primitive Cookery, is a collection of recipes that was put together in the mid-18th century. Specifically, the author thought, oh, I want to collect these recipes that are good for people of lower economic means. So he recommends things that are mostly vegetarian that we would call today economically, because he was looking for inexpensive things. This book set aside almost 3 pages to talk about potatoes, and it isn't that big a book, so it's an important part of this book. There's a section here where it talks about the Irish have several ways of eating them. The poorer sort eat them with salt only after they are boiled, others with butter and salt, but most with milk and sugar. I thought that was interesting. Someday maybe we'll do milk and sugar potatoes. This part at the beginning, some people when they are boiled have a sauce ready to pour over them made with butter, salt, and pepper. Others use gravy sauce. That's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be getting these potatoes ready. So let's get started. So after about 15 minutes, we're going to take our potatoes off. We're going to deal with those in a minute. Now it's time to work on this sauce. And so many of those recipes had a simple butter sauce. We're going to combine 2 sauces at once, right? We've got gravy in here, meat gravy, the drippings that came off, along with some butter. We're going to warm that up here on the fire. As soon as that warms up, then we're going to add some salt and pepper. That's going to be our sauce that we're going to put on these potatoes. Well, there they are, something you could find on the richest table and the poorest table. Let's see how these turned out. Perfect. Potatoes have just enough texture to them. You don't turn these into instant mashed potatoes. So I have some wonderful texture. A butter sauce with salt and pepper. So simple, so wonderful. Just enough of that meat gravy in here. They taste great. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we're digging into a recipe from 1773, amazing fine sausages. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So I picked this recipe out because we haven't done sausage in quite a while. It's a good, interesting recipe for the amount of ingredients that are in it and the specificity of how much care you have to take with these different items and how they need to be prepared. So it tells us a lot about what their sausage was exactly like and even what the ingredients were like. It also caught my eye as I was thinking about preservation, and this is a short-term preservation technique for the pork that is used in this sausage. It's something that you would probably make up and store for 2, 3, 4 weeks and have it stored in your larder, and you would be using it all throughout. So it's a fairly large recipe as it's shown in the book. So this recipe is from 1773. It's from this wonderful cookbook, The Universal Cook by John Townsend. I know it sounds like I wrote it, but it's not, apparently not one of my relations. But wonderful cookbook. So our 3 main ingredients, the first one is pork, and the recipe actually calls for taking pork meat, chopping it fine, and then using your mortar and pestle until you turn it into a paste. Now, obviously today, instead of doing all that work, we just buy ground pork. It's so much easier. So we're gonna start off with ground pork, and we also need an equal amount of suet. And this is beef suet. It's a little bit tricky to come by, but when you get it, it's so useful in so many different kinds of recipes, especially boiled puddings. But it's one of these ingredients that we really need for our sausage, so we have the right amount of fat that's included. So we got suet here. That's again an equal quantity, and the other sort of main ingredient is sage. We need to have a good quantity of sage. I recommend nice fresh sage like the recipe uses. You can also use dried sage, but we got sage here. Now for our spices, we have some of the standard stuff that of course we're going to see in every recipe like this. It includes salt, it includes pepper. We also have other sweet herbs, so if you've got thyme, if you've got rosemary, it's got lemon zest, which I thought was a nice ingredient. That's always very, very aromatic and wonderful flavor. And of course, like most 18th century recipes, it includes nutmeg, something we'd probably leave out today, but of course, we're gonna add it. Mix looks good. Everything's kind of broken down and thoroughly mixed together. Now in the recipe, he actually talks about taking this mixture, which you wouldn't all cook up at once. I mean, the recipe starts off with it's like a 12-pound recipe. You wouldn't necessarily cook those all up at once. You would store it. You might store it for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and you would store it in a storage jar, something possibly like this one, and you would pack it down into the jar, as the directions say, with as little air as possible. You don't want to pack that down tightly. Now, of course, today we would put this in the refrigerator. In the time period, they would store that in your larder or down in your cellar where it was someplace nice and cold. You might even cover this up to keep air out as much as possible. And then you would take that out when it was ready to be cooked, and then these get rolled up into little sausage shapes. Let's go ahead and form these up into shapes and get them on the fire. These cooked up and they smelled tremendous. Of course, right there on the open fire, and the sausage smells wonderful. Now, we could have made these with beef. We could have put these in skins. Both of that's mentioned right there in the recipe book, but we just cooked them up like this, the most simple and quickest way. Let's find out how they taste. Well, there's the sage is the first thing that pops out on these. And the sage, being fresh sage, I tell you, it's completely different than anything you'd buy in the store. Sage is a common thing that we still put in sausage today, but I'm sure most of it's like dried and the flavor's kind of weird. Fresh sage is just amazing in these. And of course, the salt, the pepper, it goes along with that wonderful pork flavor. The suet in there makes them nice and rich and juicy, and you can still get that lemon flavor coming through, and there's just that hint of nutmeg. There was actually quite a bit. There were, in that 12 pounds, there were 2 whole nutmegs in that recipe. In fact, out of a lot of 18th century recipes, this one actually tells you most of the quantities to actually put in. You don't have to guess as much. So it's a very good recipe for that. And boy, does it really, really turn out to be a great sausage. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today's recipe is, well, it's an 18th century creme brulee, but with a twist. We'll find out just what that is. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. This recipe is again from The Professed Cook by Claremont. This is an 18th century English cookbook that is a translation of a slightly earlier French cookbook. So this is French cooking in England in the 18th century. This one is called Fried Crème, and it is, well, let's find out. Let me read this for you. Boil a pint of cream with sugar, lemon peel, coriander seed, cinnamon. Reduce it to half, then mix 6 yolks of eggs beat up and sift with a sieve. Bake as all the others. There are multiple recipes that are kind of similar to that. Only rather more when it is cold. I don't, what does that mean? Cut it into small square pieces or in any other shape. Flour them to fry and serve them with a sugar glaze, which is done easily by strewing over a little powdered sugar and a hot shovel. This can seem a very confusing recipe. In fact, we've read it multiple times and it's like, okay, now what is it? What are they really trying to get at here? What's this? You kind of have to interpret both, looking at similar recipes in this cookbook and trying to figure out what they're leaving out, what they're putting in here. But we're making a custard, we're baking it, then we're letting it cool down, slicing it up, frying it, and then putting a sugar glaze on the top. This one's a little more difficult. Should be fun though. Certainly sounds good. Let's get started with that first step. Let's start with this custard mix, or at least the beginning of our custard mix. We've got some cream here. There's a lot of cream here. 2 cups of cream. I need about a half a cup of sugar. So I've got just standard old white granulated sugar here. There's a half a cup. We have our cinnamon. I'm gonna go ahead and just break 1 stick in half, toss it in. We've got some coriander seeds. This isn't ground coriander, it's a whole seed. It'll get stripped out later on with our sieve. Some lemon peel, and lemon's kind of a real important part of this, so we're gonna put in several lemon peel pieces here. And now this is gonna go on the fire. Low and slow on this. We're going to slowly bring it up to just about the boil. Depending on the temperature of your fire here, you've got to be really careful that this mixture does not burn, this cream does not burn in your pan. So I'm going to stir it a good bit. And if you let it come to boil too much, it'll froth up and try to go over the top. Then you've gotten too hot. So you can either lower the fire or pull this pan away. We're trying to reduce this down a good bit, at least as far as the recipe is concerned. So we're trying to drive off some of this moisture and sort of get all these flavors infused in it, because we're going to take these spices out later on. So we're infusing the flavors into this. Once it's reduced down to the amount, we're going to actually take this, we're going to let it cool down a little bit, and now we can incorporate our egg yolks. Or in my circumstance, I'm basically doing it the other direction. I'm whisking up my 6 egg yolks and slowly pouring the mixture in. I don't want to cook those egg yolks, so that's why we let this cool down a little bit. Depending on how you want to temper your eggs, you might not have to cool down this far, but I let it cool down this far to make it easy. Once it gets about halfway there, you're good. You can dump in the whole mixture, whisk it, and then we're going to separate this out with a sieve. These are very common in the 18th century. This sieve is a horsehair sieve, and I'm using it to both get rid of all the spices, as well as all the little bits of egg that might not be so smooth in that mixture, which is very common in an 18th century recipe, which we don't necessarily take all the time for in a recipe today. But we're going to sieve all that out so it's a very, very smooth mixture. And now this is ready to bake. Now, when we're doing something like a creme brulee, we might bake this in a water bath, but in this circumstance, we want it to be kind of firm. So we're gonna go ahead and just bake it up in a Dutch oven in this circumstance. The recipe actually kind of calls for baking it in a dish with coals on top. Well, that's exactly what we've got here. A Dutch oven will allow us to bake it from the top and the bottom. You will probably just bake this in your modern kitchen. So it's going to be much easier for you to bake this at a low temperature, maybe 300 degrees. And a vessel like this, the amount that we've done here, will bake about 30, 35 minutes. But we're going to get this Dutch oven going and get this baking. So after our 35 minutes in the oven, it might not look totally solidified, but it will start to solidify as it cools off. And once this is totally cooled off and it is nice and firm, we can then cut it up into our shapes or pieces. I'm just gonna cut simple squares out of this, but if you wanted to do some fancy shapes, you can do that. Then once this is cut up into our pieces that are about 3/8 of an inch thick, or so, we're gonna just do a quick flouring of this, and then they go into the oil, and we're gonna go ahead and deep fat fry these. You could try pan frying them, but we're gonna deep fat fry these at the typical temperature of 375 or so. Bring that oil up to temperature, drop them in. It doesn't take very long for them to cook. You don't want them to turn dark brown necessarily. It depends on the flavor you're looking for. But a nice medium brown. We're gonna pull these out and of course let them sort of dry, cool off. Then they get powdered sugar put on the top. And then, as the directions call for, a hot shovel, a red hot shovel gets, or a salamander, gets over these to melt the sugar. Of course, today we'd probably use a little blowtorch or something like that. It's much easier, but in the time period they would use a red hot shovel to melt that sugar, turn it into almost like a little glass surface on the top of these little mini creme brulees. Now the sugar that we put up on top of these is kind of like a powdered sugar today, but not quite that fine. You kind of want one of those finer than a standard granulated sugar, but not quite as powdered sugar as you get. This is kind of sort of half ground in a mortar to make it a sort of a very, very fine sugar, and that's what we put on top. Well, there they are. They're beautiful. They smell good, but they took a lot of effort to cook down the cream and then make the custard mix, and then you bake it, and then you have to cool it and let it flour it, and you cook it. Let's hope they're really good. Well, let's try one of these out. They're really nice in that you can, pick them up with your fingers. That's probably, the nicest feature these particular guys have. Nice little crunch on top. Very tasty, very tasty. Very creamy, lots and lots of lemon flavor in there. I really enjoy this. It reminds me of the lemon cream that we've done in a past episode. Very good. Now the real question for me on these is it worth it? I mean, if you've done a creme brulee before, you sort of get to the halfway point, and then, you'd have that whole, those little ramekins filled maybe with the mixture, and then you put the sugar on top and then torch it, and boom, you're done. You'd skip that whole step of flouring and then frying, and then I'll tell you, it's probably not worth it. I think if I was going to do it, I would just go straight to the ramekins and torch it and not worry about it. The whole, getting the oil, having oil ready to go and then deep fat frying them, I don't think it's worth it. But tell you what, these are super tasty. They are right out of the cookbook. But if you go another 5 or 6 recipes back in the Professed Cook here, you'll find a straight creme brulee recipe that's also very, very time period oriented. We tried this out because it sounded very, very interesting and like it was going to go someplace we didn't expect. It was still an excellent, and I love these, experiences where, you know, you got to try it out. Unless you try it out, you just have no idea where you're going. If you're looking for an 18th century cookbook that is got, you know, French inspiration, or basically is a translated French cookbook from the 18th century, can't recommend this one more.